Hello, and welcome to my presentation about validation of IT systems in the regulated industries. My name is Siri Segalstad. I've been working with practical validation of IT systems in regulated industries and also with LIMS for more than 30 years. I have included a few pictures from my home country, Norway, so in case you wonder where they are from, and I hope you will enjoy them. The validation definitions are slightly different from different standards. The ISO 17025 says that validation is the confirmation by examination and the provisions of objective evidence that a particular requirement for a specific intended use are fulfilled. The U.S. Food and Drugs Administration says that validation is defined as establishing documented evidence which provides a high degree of assurance that a specific process will consistently produce a product meeting its predetermined specifications and quality attributes. While it seems like these two definitions are different, I think they basically say the same. One talks about the objective evidence and the other about documented evidence. The underlines there, they are mine. I will now talk about how to validate IT systems, regardless of which standard you have to comply with. Why validate? The standards state that validation of your processes are needed. IT systems are part of these processes. However, the more important issue is not actually what the standards say and the requirements are, but the fact that you need to understand your processes and trust the system to maintain your data integrity. So what if we don't validate? For pharma, regulating bodies like the FDA can deny us to send the products to the market. Other labs like contract labs or calibration labs may lose their accreditation. And regardless what industry you're in, the consequences are big. Validation must be done on-site by the users. You cannot buy a validated system. Testing does not replace built-in quality. Validation must be performed before the system is taken into real use and continues throughout the system's life cycle. The good thing and the bad thing is that the extent of the validation is defined by the users. Regardless of which standard applies, it's totally the end user's responsibility to validate his system. That is on his site, on his platform, as implemented in his company, and as used in his organization. So which requirements apply? That depends on the industry and on the market. For pharma, it's the GxPs that apply. GxP is good manufacturing practice, good laboratory practice, and good clinical practice. Additionally, if you send the products to the US market, you have to comply with the 21 CFR Part 11, which covers electronic data and electronic signatures. If you send to the EU market, you have to comply with the EU equivalent of the 21 CFR Part 11, namely the GMP Annex 11. ISO 17025 gives a global accreditation. Additionally, you need to have your own quality system internally in your organization, and that is regardless of the standard that you're using. Validation of the IT systems may be a challenge. We're trained as scientists and understand the chemistry, biology, processes, analytical methods, etc. that we work on a daily basis. We're not trained the same way with IT systems because the IT systems are just tools to help us do our work. We need to understand what the IT systems do in order to understand how to handle them. Fortunately, we don't really need to know anything about programming in order to do this. Validation is a large job and may be made somewhat easier by dividing the tasks into smaller pieces. These pieces may be the DQ, IQ, OQ, PQ approach of the GxP and GAMP, and I will explain these later. Or it could be any other suitable division. Earlier, it was more common to test the final system to see that it worked okay, and that was sufficient. Today, the life cycle approach is the only acceptable way of doing anything. Life cycle approach is to make sure that you have control over the whole process from conception of the IT system to the retirement. And the conception is the vendor's responsibility, so that makes it a little bit more difficult. Standards have different information and can be useful to read, even if you don't have to comply with that particular standard. So that's one place to get help. The other places could be GAMP 5, which I'm going to cover. It could be books that are available, classes, training, conferences, at least not in this COVID-19 period. You could also get some help from consultants. But regardless of how you do it, you need to be a part of it yourself, because you are ultimately responsible in your organization, regardless of who have actually done it. Now, GAMP, good automated manufacturing practice. In my opinion, it's the best tool there is, regardless of the industry. GAMP started in 1991 to explain what to do with the IT systems in the pharmaceutical industry. Now it's in its 5th version, hence GAMP 5. There are additional guidelines and books for risk-based approach to compliant electronic records and signatures, validation of computerized laboratory systems, testing of critical systems, and several more references in the guidebook. GAMP is also very useful, even if you're not in the pharmaceutical industry. According to GAMP, there are 5 software categories. Category 1 is infrastructure software. Category 2 is no longer in use, but it's still there. Category 3 is non-configured products. Category 4, configured products. And Category 5, custom applications. In this presentation, I will only go through Category 4, as that is what LIMS is. LIMS may, however, also include custom-built or so-called bespoke software for your organization, and that software will have to be treated as Category 5. So the Category 4 is configured products, and this is defined as software, often very complex, that can be configured by the user to meet the specific needs of the user's business process. The software code is not altered. Examples are laboratory information management systems, LIMS, SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition systems, various manufacturing enterprise systems, electronic document management systems, etc. Validation of the Category 4 starts with the conception of the system. That is the vendor's job. And it continues with our job as users with selection of the system, installation, implementation, testing, and finally maintaining the system in a validated state by complying with procedures for the system. The GAMP 5 approach is first to do a risk management to decide how important the system is in the process. This can be used, you can use GAMP 5 or the risk guide for that. You decide what category of software to decide what needs to be done, and you can find more information about that in GAMP 5. And then you will combine the risks and categories to decide what to do with this specific system. There's also a testing guide that will help you find out how to test the system. Risk assessment. Requirements for records in the GxP regulations are also relevant for the other standards like 17025. And product quality also includes lab results from an accredited lab. The potential impact of records on patient safety is, of course, a high risk. And also impact on records on products and services for the ISO 17025. We're generally using 3 classification levels: high, which could cover cleaning, deviation and investigation, batch records; medium, training, calibration, approvals and authorizations; and low could be planning documents. We can manage the identified risks in several different ways. Modifying the process. The process may be any process in production, laboratory, IT system, and by changing the process, the risk may, in some cases, be less than when the original process is used. We can modify the system design, and the system design is about the IT system. We can apply technical controls, and those may, for example, be that fewer people have access to important functions in the system, for example, approvals, modifications of static data, or user access. And finally, the last resort is the procedural controls. This is if it's not possible to make technical changes to the process, system, or technical control, the procedures or standard operating procedures can tell what is allowed and what is not allowed. The problem with the procedures is that people may follow them or not. New understanding of the processes make it possible to see other or different or previously unrecognized risks or to assess the existing risks differently. So we need to monitor the effectiveness of the controls. We'll verify that the controls are effective, consider if unrecognized hazards are present, if the estimated risk is different, if the original assessment is still valid. And this will feed back into the risk management. When controls have been added, the risks should be less than they were before the controls. But we need to reassess the risks to show the current state and document that. And the assessment should, of course, feed back into the risk management in order to effectively manage the risks. Now, GAMP5 has this really large form for describing responsibilities between the supplier and the user. We're not going through this in detail, but please note that you may leverage the supplier involvement. It's close to the bottom there, meaning that you do not have to repeat what he has already done. Terminology is still the most common terminology for the validation purposes is the DQ, IQ, OQ, PQ concept from GAMP4. And even if this terminology has been changed to verification activities in GAMP5. You decide which terminology you want to use, and you define that terminology in your organization. Terminology varies between standards and also from company to company, and this is perfectly acceptable. As long as you define your terminology and stick to your definitions. This is my model for IT systems validation. The green arrows down going from top to bottom are what you in the user organization is responsible for when you are validating your system. If you look at the top DQ green arrow, there you will find DQ, IQ, OQ, PQ, and those are the vendor's responsibilities because the vendor has developed the system. Our job is to check in our DQ that this has been done in a quality environment. Now, the brown arrows down in the PQ, which are called the items there, they are new or changed analytical methods, sample types, specifications, instruments, etc. inside our system. These need to be validated also, and that's also often done in the PQ or post-PQ period. I will be going through the validation plan in detail as this forms the outline for your system validation. So the next quite a few slides will cover that, and I will tell you when I'm at the bottom of the validation plan. First of all, can some information be found elsewhere? If you have information found in other documents in your organization, they shall be referred to or hyperlinked to and not repeated in your validation plan. And the reason for that is that it is impossible to keep repeated info updated everywhere. So make a reference list at the end of the document with document name, ID, versions, and dates for the references. The first pages of the plan are according to your normal requirements for documents. I will let you read it and refer to it later, and I will skip the details here. And you will also have to look into your company's procedures to see what you really need in your plan. The same goes for this page, really. In the validation plan, we need to describe how to handle errors and corrective actions, preventive actions, also called CAPA. We will describe how to handle errors during the validation period, and you may have an error handling SOP, but following that may be tedious and not really necessary for a system that is not yet in production. So how we can do is that we describe something in the validation plan. CAPA for internal matters like errors in the hardware or software, user errors or implementation errors. We need to plan the correction if appropriate. We need to correct the errors, document how the correction has been done, revalidate or retest when possible or if appropriate, report the corrective actions and revalidation results, approve it and or authorize it, and then create a preventive action and approving and authorizing this. Okay. So another example is that you will have to define if the problem is solved when the next version of the system is released, maybe a year from now, or maybe you have received an acknowledgement from the supplier. That is if you find system errors. The validation plan also needs to cover acceptance criteria. They are predefined in the validation plan. It's easy to write that we do not accept any errors and no errors is the desired outcome, but it is kind of difficult to live with as we usually do find some errors. It's also impossible to foresee which errors you will find and to discuss or rate them upfront. Instead, you can define a score system for serious errors, medium errors, and we can live with these errors, and have that defined in the validation plan. With scores, you can set up a calculation for what the acceptance criteria can be. It could be like a total score, add all the error scores, number of serious errors, number of medium errors, combination of this, like a total score of so much and not more than so much of type whatever errors. Remember also that each error may be found more than once, but it shall only be counted once. The validation plan describes the phases. It defines the phase with the input, during, and the output. Describes in which order each of the validation activities shall be done, as this is not really obvious in the model I showed you. For example, some PQ items may have to be done during the DQ, IQ, or OQ phase, etc. In this presentation, I want to focus on the DQ, IQ, OQ, PQ phases. And that is because these are the most well-known terminology that we use. You may, of course, use any model or any type of phases or even no phases as long as they're defined and described and adhered to. The overview of the phases. You will have a phase name, you will have definition, prerequisites for the start of the phase, input to the phase, what to do during the phase, and what's the outcome of the phase. So we'll start with the first one, and that's the development qualification. The development qualification shall ensure that the software has been developed in a structured way in a quality environment. So the DQ inputs would be project proposal, approval start of the project for the new IT system, and if you have some guidelines and SOPs for this type of work, that is of course also something that needs to be taken into consideration. Now, I like to make a three-phase DQ, and I think the DQ has several distinctive tasks. So that's why I call them DQ 1, 2, and 3. As you can see, the phases are partly overlapping, but I think they still make sense. The DQ 1 is the user requirement specification, the assessment of the vendor's answers to the requirement specification, and then the contract. The DQ2 would be to audit the top vendor, and that, of course, needs to come before the contract if you decide to audit the top vendor or the top vendors. The DQ3 is the implementation, functional and design specification, and the DQ1 and 2 are before we make the decision to buy the system, whereas the DQ3 is the implementation, which of course is after we've decided to buy this particular system. The output of the DQ phase is that we will have a well-created system in a quality environment by the supplier or vendor, whatever you want to call them, a correctly configured system for the company's use, a system description, and a DQ report. The DQ report will refer to other documents like the supplier audit report, functional specification, the user requirement specification, and will not repeat the content. The IQ installation qualification shall ensure that the hardware and the software are installed properly and that installation works according to the intentions. The IQ is by far the quickest of the phases. We basically need to keep track of all hardware, software, and the choices selected when the system is installed. There will eventually be more than one instance of the database. We generally have a sandbox database where we play around trying to find out how to do things, and this is not under any type of control. The implementation or validation instance, where we implement the system, this needs to be under control. We also use this for validating the system itself and the implemented and configured data. When the configured data has been validated, we can move this to the live instance so that it can be used. Then we have the live database instance. That is a controlled copy of the validation instance. This is used in the lab for real data. We may also have a possible training instance where we train people. This is often a copy of the implementation or live database. It does not have to be under control, and the users can play with it during the training. The input to the IQ is the installation guideline, if we have any, an SOP for installation, manuals for the system. And what we're doing during the IQ phase is we start the system and configuration management. We start the system backup procedures. We have an installation test plan, and we do the installation testing. And the output is the installation report. The operation qualification, OQ, will ensure that the system operates according to the intentions stated in the functional specification, which is directly derived from the user requirement specification, the URS. Thus, it is a control that the system functions the way it has been written and implemented for the company. The input to the OQ phase is the system functional and design specification, the IQ documents. If we have a guideline, we will have that. What we do during the OQ phase is to have plans, including the test plans. We have the test records, and the output is the OQ report. Then there is the performance or process qualification, the PQ. That will show that the system performs according to the business intentions in the company's environment. The phase will also ensure that the system will continue to be in a validated state after it has been taken into use. Now, there are two ways of defining PQ. The PQ phase finishes when the system is authorized for live use. Or we can let the PQ phase never finish. It's ongoing validation and activities until retirement. But for validation purposes, we usually let the process or performance qualification finish when the system validation has been closed off. However, we need also to ensure that we have ongoing validation activities for the rest of the time we use the system, and I will get back to that a little later. The PQ input will be the system functional and design specification, the IQ and OQ documents, and if we have a guideline for life cycle, that would also be an input. What we create during the phase is the PQ plan, including the test plans. We create the test records, and we have a PQ report as the outcome. For all, it is possible to have OQ and PQ separately or in one phase. And the question is, what do we want to do? In my opinion, for all practical purposes, it's actually better to combine the OQ and the PQ. We're going to test each of the functions anyway in the OQ, and they might just as well be tested inside the workflow, PQ, where we're using them. But it is for you to make the decision in your organization. I know of at least one organization with the SOP system where they have strictly divided these two phases, and that caused a lot of extra work for them because they really had to retest a lot of the functions from the OQ also in the PQ. I will talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but this is the end of the validation plan. Now we'll go on. I'll talk more about each of the qualifications, or actually not each of them, but more like what we do with all of the qualifications. All of them will include writing the qualification plan, what to do, how to do it, who will do it. We will follow the plan and test according to the plan. We will create test documentation during the testing, and we will write the qualification report. As with the validation plan, the first pages are according to your normal requirements for documents, and I will let you read this and refer to it later and skip the details. The qualification plan details will be a plan for what to do, write it up or refer to other documents, plan for how to do it, including the sequence and the task. The test plans will have identification for each of the items, what to do in detail, expected results, room for making notes and signatures during the testing, and we may also have references to the user requirement specification or functional specification as appropriate. That's called traceability. We will also include the acceptance criteria. The test documentation. We will document while we are testing. It could be done paper or electronically. We'll mark pass and fail while we are testing. And also we will create as much documentation as possible. It could be printouts, reports, screen prints, comments, and we will sign and date after testing and of course save all the documentation. This is just a few lines of real test plan, so you can see how I like to write the test plan. However, it's perfectly okay for you to do it totally differently. This contains a column with a reference. It has a column with what to do, a column for expected results. It has room for comments and links to additional documentation. And it has links to the user requirement specification or functional specification. This is often called a traceability matrix. One may also want, or instead want to create a separate document as the traceability matrix between the user requirement specification, the functional specification, and the testing itself. This will give a better overview, and if you're using Excel, it can be sorted in various ways. The qualification report. There are some requirements for that. Do not repeat the plan. Do not repeat the results. Focus on the conclusions. Discuss the errors that have been found and state if the testing has met the acceptance criteria. Keep it short. As we go along in the process, we generally have a string of events where one is dependent on the previous. When one qualification report is authorized, this will usually be the prerequisite for a go for the next phase. So DQ will have to be finished before the IQ, and the same with the IQ before the OQ-PQ. When all of these qualification reports have been done, we will write the validation report, summarizing up the whole validation, and I will get back to that. System testing is IQ and OQ together. This is one suggestion for how to do this. System testing often comprises OQ and parts of PQ. OQ testing is checking that each command or function works as it's supposed to do. This is very often tested by the supplier as well. And if we have access to that, then we don't need to do all the same testing. The PQ is testing that these commands or functions work well in the workflow that we have in our organization. We can test these together if your quality system allows it. Workflow tests are created based on the workflow described in the user requirement specification. And if the user requirement specification does not exist, it is not possible to test it because you have the questions, but you do not have the expected answers. Your workflow, which is how you want to use the system in your organization, needs to be tested, even if your functions OQ have been tested by the supplier or by your company separately. The process qualification is the workflow in the system. It could be something like this, or it could be something totally different, or it may be variations of that depending on what you are testing. But anyway, it needs to be described and you need to test it. You also need to test not only everything goes right, but also test whatever happens when something goes wrong. The testing itself, actually the testing itself does not take an awful lot of time if it has been properly planned, and then the job goes smoothly. If everybody knows what they are going to do and they know who is going to test the next part of it, then it will be done relatively quickly, even if there are pretty complex testing regimes. The validation report. The validation report is the conclusion of the validation. When I write the report, I like to start with the validation plan and change that to create the report. For example, when the requirement in the validation plan is that we shall create, for example, the OQ-PQ plan, I will enter the reference to that plan. I also enter the reference to all of the other qualification plans, reports, etc., to all the SOPs and other documents that we have created in the process. So the validation report will sum up the validation activities from the different phases, does not repeat the plan and the results, focus on the conclusions, discuss the errors that have been found, and state if the testing met the acceptance criteria. Quality assurance persons sign it off, meaning that the system can now be used live. SOPs for each system. Now, if you want to keep the system in a validated state, we need to have it under something close to a complete control. This can best be done by having standard operating procedures or SOPs for the system. There's a long list of SOPs to keep a large system like LIMS in a validated state at all times. I do not have time to go through the detailed content on this list, but more information on each SOP can be found in the books that I've written, and there will be a reference at the end here. As with all quality documents, SOPs will need to have reference to each other instead of repeating the same information. I will talk a little bit about some of these SOPs. We have access to the system. Who shall have access? Who shall give the access? And how shall it be reassessed? But I think the most frequently forgotten thing in the access SOP is that withdrawal of access. It is extremely important to make sure that a disgruntled, terminated employee cannot access or do damage to the data at the same day as he or she is leaving the company. So make sure that you have a procedure that will terminate also his or her access. Change control. Error handling with CAPA, change control, and revalidation are closely linked. We need to have change control all the way through the life cycle, and changes shall be evaluated for consequences before implemented. Otherwise, we will have some really fun or not so fun things going on. Changes in plans require changes in testing. All changes and evaluations must be documented, and all revisions must be available. A little bit about the change control in detail. What do we do? Who can suggest changes? Who can receive the change request, and how shall it be documented? How shall the change be assessed and by whom? And the impact of the assessment. How shall that be documented or assessed for that matter? What if the request is turned down? Can the requester get a second opinion? Depending on the assessment, how shall change be handled and how shall change be documented? We also need an SOP for configuration management. Now, those are a couple of different things of configuration management. One is the internal data in the system. Which static data or template data need to be under configuration management? Which dynamic data or daily use data need to be under configuration management, if we need to have any at all? How shall this be carried out? Who can change configuration? And how shall it be documented? But we also have configuration management outside of the system itself. We need configuration management of the servers and clients and other hardware, network, the software, the operating system, database system, and the system itself. The FDA has required that we plan for decommissioning, and I personally think it's kind of like planning the funeral when the baby has not yet been born. So what I usually like to do is that to write the SOP as required, stating that when the system is ready for retirement, plans must be made for its decommissioning and for how to preserve the data in the system. If a new system shall replace the current one, the process must follow the current procurement SOPs. Now we have planned it and documented, and we have not said a single thing about it. We also need SOPs for daily use. For a large system like a LIMS system, this probably should be divided into several SOPs, each with their own targets. And the targets could be user groups, products, labs, organization parts, or whatever is most appropriate in your organization. What does this SOP cover? What information shall be entered and where in the system? Are there mandatory and optional entries, workflows, or whatever is appropriate? Do not include how things shall be done, because the users are expected to be trained. And if you state that we will use the top left menu, go down 3 phases and press that button and go down to next menu, then you are in a lot of problem whenever the system is being updated. So expect the users to know how to do this, use the system, but they need to know where the information shall be. And also there needs to be references to other SOPs for the daily use if there are more than one. Disaster recovery and business continuity are actually 2 aspects of the same issue. Disaster recovery, generally the IT department's job to fix the problems, provided the building hasn't burned down or been broken by an earthquake or something. Whereas the business continuity is the user organization's job. How do we work when the system is not up and running? To have those plans is one thing, but we really need to test the disaster recovery plans and the business continuity plans. Document the testing and what happened during the testing and make the report, because it is too late to do it when you need it and it doesn't work. The SOP for error handling would cover definitions of errors, who can report an error and how is this done, who shall receive an error report, how shall it be documented, how to assess them, how serious are they, and what the impact, etc. All this needs to be defined. How shall we handle it? And that, of course, depends on the assessment. And finally, the CAPA, Corrective Actions, Preventive Actions. Which preventive actions are needed to avoid the error being repeated? That could be, for example, update of an SOP. I talked about earlier that we might have more than one instance of the LIMS database. We need at least the sandbox, and we may need the training. These are largely uncontrolled, but we also need at least 2 controlled instances, the validation or testing instance and implementation instance for testing, and then the production or live instance. They both need to be under control. Now, remember the validation model in the beginning? This is about the brown arrows inside the PQ. We need to qualify the static data in the system, and this can be done independently of validating the system itself, because we continuously add data or change static data. We add new analytical methods, new specifications, we change analytical methods, we change products, etc. And these need to be qualified or validated to see that it has been entered correctly and can be used as planned. So it is possible to include the various test plans inside the SOPs, maybe as appendix or something. This means that the test plans are pre-approved. That could be useful. We also need the SOP to explain what data needs formal qualifications and how shall it be qualified. The SOP for static data may want to include screen prints that show all the fields and explain each of the fields. Now, again, that might be a problem if an update of the system makes it different. But what is important is to describe which fields are mandatory and which fields are optional. Which rules distinguish between those? So I said exactly what shall be entered, including naming conventions and nomenclature. State exactly how to name these fields. The naming must be consistent in order to be able to compare the data. And I can tell you that when I implemented a LIMS system in the late 80s in the company that I used to work for, we realized that there were 12 different ways of writing weight percent. 12 different ways. As readers, we understand that the W's before or after percent, or upper or lowercase, or even space or no space between the W's and the percent are the same, but the system does not. So the result was that with 12 different ways of writing weight percent, 11 had to be changed. And 11 groups of people were unhappy about this darn LIMS system that did not write weight percent the way they wanted it to. Whether we have the system description in an SOP or we just have it as a system description is really up to each of the organization's suggestions. But we need an overview of the processes where the system is being used. We need the main data and electronic records, diagrammatic overview of the system, software, hardware, IT infrastructure, interface to other systems, and which data is moved to and from these systems, locations of the systems, and operation and maintenance strategy. We also need to describe responsibilities for the system: owner, operation, administration, maintenance. Could be named departments or roles, but not named individuals. How and when shall the description be updated? Reference to other SOPs, configuration management, generic SOP, generic system descriptions, sorry. Training is an important part. The LIMS users or the system users need to be trained, and the SOP will explain a little bit about that. How shall who be notified when somebody needs training, and how much training does each of the different types of users need based on their roles in the system? Who's responsible for providing training, and what shall be included in training, like theory and practice? A new role, new training, how training is documented in training records, CVs, etc. I know this has been a lot of information, and it is a lot more to learn. In a lab I visited at some point, I found this stating that theory is you know everything but nothing works. Practice is everything works but you do not know why. And we in our lab combine theory and practice. Nothing works and nobody knows why. However, I think that in a quality assured lab, they combined theory and practice in a totally different way. Everything works and everybody knows why. And that is the goal for us. I have written a book called International IT Regulations and Compliance, and it covers the quality management system with emphasis on the IT system, Has a large chapter on instruments in the lab and a large chapter on LIMS. And here is my contact information, and you're welcome to contact me if you are interested. Oh, I got this wrong. I did not click on the slides on the show there. Could we go back a little bit?
Yes. To what slide are you going to go back to?
Yeah, I'll find the number here. Go back to slide 83. Is that the last one you saw?
Yes, theory and practice.
Okay,
yeah.
and we can take slide 84. However, I think that a quality assured lab combines theory and practice in a totally different way. Everything works and everybody knows why. This concludes my very, very short presentation on the validation of IT systems. If you are interested in reading a little bit more, I have written a book called International IT Regulations and Compliance. This covers a lot of different standards, quality management system with the emphasis on IT systems. It has a large chapter on instruments in the lab and a large chapter on LIMS. And also, here is my contact information in case you want to contact me, and you're certainly welcome to do so. Thank you very much for listening to me.